Linwood Hall rises in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. It has 110 rooms and 34 bedrooms. It contains over 21,000 square feet of neoclassical limestone, designed by Horace Trumbauer between 1897 and 1900. The largest abandoned mansion in America is valued above $100 million. Built for one of the richest industrialists of the Gilded Age, it once held Rembrandts and Raphaels. Today, its corridors are empty, its ballroom silent. The dynasty that built it, gone. How does a $100 million palace become too big to save? It starts with the man who believed he could build one that would last forever. Peter Arrell Brown. Widener began life far from the marble halls of Linwood. Born in 1834 to a Philadelphia brickmaker, he left school early, learning the value of hard work in his father's butcher shop. The turning point came in 1862, when the US government awarded him a $50,000 contract to supply meat to Union troops during the Civil War, a sum that would change his fortunes forever. With that windfall, Widener did not just improve his own circumstances, he saw the potential to reshape an entire city. He poured his profits into the Philadelphia Traction Company, consolidating dozens of small, struggling streetcar lines into a single network. By the 1880s, Widener's trolleys stretched over 500 miles, carrying workers and families from the city's heart to its farthest edges. The traction monopoly became a money machine, churning out steady cash in an era when public transport meant progress. But Widener's ambitions reached well beyond city streets. The steady flow of trolley fares allowed him to buy into the Pennsylvania Railroad and, later, a founding stake in US Steel, America's industrial backbone. He quietly acquired shares in Standard Oil and American Tobacco, diversifying his empire at a time when fortunes were built on consolidation and risk. By the dawn of the 20th century, Widener's net worth hovered around $100 million, over $3 billion today. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Vanderbilt and Carnegie, not by inheritance, but by relentless calculation and a willingness to bet big. Every mile of track, every steel share, every dollar earned was a step toward a vision. A home that would not just shelter a family, but announce an arrival. In the American Gilded Age, few stories rose so far, so fast, or carried such weight. Linwood Hall would become the monument to that ascent. A palace built not just of stone, but of ambition, risk, and the belief that wealth could shape the future. Peter Arrell Brown. Widener saw Linwood Hall as more than a personal estate. He imagined it as a living gallery, a private museum that would place his family among the world's great cultural patrons. In a letter to his wife around 1900, Widener described his vision: a living gallery where our family may dwell among the great masters, and where the world may be invited to witness the triumph of American industry and art. This ambition drove every decision, from the scale of the house to its layout. The mansion's design prioritized art above comfort, with entire wings devoted to paintings, sculpture, and rare books. At its peak, Linwood Hall held a collection of more than 300 masterpieces, assembled with the help of European dealers and displayed in rooms engineered for natural light and climate control. The list of artists reads like a survey of Western art history: Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Raphael, El Greco, Titian. One gallery held a Rembrandt portrait acquired for $75,000, a staggering sum at the turn of the century. Another showcased a study by Raphael, purchased for nearly $90,000. Works by Van Dyck and El Greco lined the walls, each chosen not just for prestige, but for their ability to anchor the Widener name in the cultural conversation of the age. This was RT as legacy, purchased with the same confidence that built railroads and steel empires. Widener's approach set Linwood Hall apart from other Gilded Age mansions. Rather than mimic the salons of Europe, he sought to surpass them, creating a home where every corridor and ballroom served the dual purpose of family life and public exhibition. The architecture grew to match the ambition: a 7,000 square foot gallery wing, a 2,000 square foot ballroom, and a 5,000 square foot library, each space calibrated to showcase the collection. The result was America's Forgotten Palace, a private museum on a scale rarely seen outside royal courts, and a testament to the belief that wealth, when paired with vision, could produce something that might outlast its maker. But the very grandeur that defined Linwood Hall would also demand a scale of stewardship few families could sustain for long. In the spring of 1897, Peter Arrol Brown Widener put pen to paper and set in motion a commission unlike anything Philadelphia had seen. He did not turn to an established European architect or to the reigning names of New York society. Instead, he chose a local talent, Horace Trumbauer, just 29 years old, already known for his grand country houses, but not yet a household name among America's elite. The letter of commission survives in the Widener family papers, its language clear about the scale of the ambition: a palace that would stand as a monument to both industry and art, and a home large enough to house generations. Trumbauer's brief called for more than comfort. He was tasked with designing a structure that would rival the great estates of Europe, but with a distinctly American confidence. The plans called for a neoclassical facade, a central portico with soaring Ionic columns, and a dome-capped rotunda that would echo the Renaissance villas of Italy. The blueprint included a public wing, a ballroom, a gallery, and a library, balanced by a private wing with 34 bedrooms, service corridors, and kitchens designed for an army of staff. The architectural program demanded permanence, with fireproof construction, steel skeletons hidden behind limestone walls, and a circulation plan that allowed the family to move from intimate rooms to grand halls without ever crossing the path of a guest. By April 1897, Trumbauer had signed the contract with George W. Miller and Sons, the builders who would translate vision into stone and steel. The design brief, filed that July, outlined not just the look of the house, but the engineering challenge ahead. Every detail, down to the routing of electric wiring and the thickness of marble flooring, was calculated to outlast the century. In a city of brick and brownstone, the announcement of a 110-room neoclassical palace with projected costs exceeding $3.5 million sent a ripple through Philadelphia's social circles. Linwood Hall was no longer just an idea. It was a blueprint for America's Forgotten Palace, a structure whose very scale would test the limits of Gilded Age ambition. The challenge now shifted from money to materials, from desire to execution. The story would be written in limestone and steel, and in the relentless vision of a young architect tasked with building a mansion that would prove too big to save. Work began in the spring of 1897, but Linwood Hall was never just a feat of design. It was an engineering project on a scale rarely attempted for a private home. Horace Trumbauer's plans called for a structure that would last centuries, and every material choice reflected that ambition. The exterior shell was built from more than 2,000 tons of limestone, quarried from Conestoga in Lancaster County. Each block, some weighing several tons, traveled by rail to the estate's private siding before being hoisted into place by teams of local and immigrant stonemasons. The limestone cladding, nearly a foot thick in places, was chosen for both its permanence and its resistance to the harsh Pennsylvania climate. Beneath the stone, a hidden skeleton of steel gave the mansion its true strength. Trumbauer and his builders ordered over 850 tons of structural steel from Bethlehem Steel Company, fabricating a lattice of 12-inch I-beams that supported the vast spans of the ballroom, library, and Great Hall. This was not standard practice for residential construction in 1900. Most mansions relied on solid masonry alone. By embedding a modern steel grid inside traditional walls, Linwood Hall became one of the earliest American houses to combine fireproofing with the ability to withstand decades of shifting foundations and relentless freeze-thaw cycles. Trumbauer's attention to longevity extended to the systems hidden behind the walls. Original wiring diagrams show the entire house equipped with electric lighting, wired by Edison Electric, at a time when many country estates still relied on gaslight. Marble floors in the Great Hall were laid over steel decking, both to resist fire and to allow for swift drainage in the event of a disaster. The result was a structure engineered not just for beauty, but for survival, a palace whose bones were meant to outlast its builders, and whose endurance would become its own kind of legacy. Even as decades of neglect and changing fortunes chipped away at the surface, the core of America's forgotten palace remained stubbornly intact, a monument to the belief that architecture, when built on this scale, could defy time itself. Evenings at Linwood Hall unfolded with a choreography as precise as the marble floors beneath the guests' feet. On the night of a grand ball, the mansion's private rail spur delivered carriages straight to the porte cochere, sparing society's elite the inconvenience of city dust. Cloaked in velvet and silk, guests stepped inside to a world engineered for spectacle. The 2,000-square-foot ballroom glowed with electric light, its gilded ceiling reflecting the movement of hundreds of dancers waltzing in time to a live orchestra stationed beneath the domed rotunda. Behind the scenes, an invisible army of staff, over 50 butlers, footmen, and maids moved in silent formation. In the kitchens, chefs plated 12-course dinners, while footmen coordinated the flow of champagne and silver trays. The house's circulation plan, mapped out by Horace Trumbauer, allowed staff to glide through hidden corridors and service stairs, ensuring that no guest ever glimpsed the machinery of hospitality. The logistics of these evenings rivaled any public event in Philadelphia. Special deliveries, fresh flowers from New York, ice sculpted in the shape of mythic gods, rare wines imported from Bordeaux arrived by rail, routed through the estate's private siding. The staff rehearsed their roles as carefully as any cast, from the synchronized opening of the ballroom doors to the final sweep of the marble floor at dawn. For a few hours, Linwood Hall was more than a mansion. It was America's forgotten palace in full command of its own legend. At its peak, the house was not just a backdrop for wealth, but a living stage where architecture, art, and society merged into an experience too grand to last. The memory of music and movement lingered in the halls, a reminder that even an estate worth $100 million could be both a triumph and a burden. The mansion too big to save. April 1912 brought a shock that no amount of wealth or planning could prevent. George Dunton Widener and his son, Harry Elkins Widener, boarded the RMS Titanic in Cherbourg, bound for New York. Their tickets placed them in some of the ship's most exclusive quarters. George was in cabin B-35. Harry was in A-10. They were surrounded by the comforts reserved for the world's elite. The journey was meant to be a return from an art-buying trip, a routine extension of the family's cultural ambitions. But on the night of April 14th, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Survivor accounts describe George helping women and children into lifeboats, refusing his own place among them. Harry, just 27, was last seen in the first-class smoking lounge, a book collector to the end, holding a newspaper as the ship's lights flickered out. Neither man survived the sinking. The news reached Linwood Hall by telegram. The family's future, so carefully mapped out in the corridors of America's forgotten palace, had vanished in a single night. The loss of both the designated heir and the favored grandson left a void that no inheritance could fill. The art galleries and marble halls built to house generations now echoed with absence. For the Wideners, the tragedy was not just personal. It fractured the line of stewardship that had kept the estate vibrant. The mansion's fate, once anchored by certainty, slipped into uncertainty. The Titanic disaster sent ripples through the family, through Linwood Hall, and through the very idea that great fortunes could guarantee continuity. The fall of a gilded empire began not with financial ruin, but with a sudden, irreversible loss at sea. The future of Linwood Hall shifted not with a single disaster, but through the slow pressure of policy and numbers. After Peter Arrol Brown Widener's death in 1915, the estate found itself facing a new and unyielding force, the federal estate tax. The Revenue Act of 1916 introduced a 1% levy on estates exceeding $5 million, a figure that might have seemed abstract until it landed on the Widener ledger. With the family fortune valued near $100 million, the tax bill soared into the millions, far beyond what could be covered by liquid assets alone. Trustees, now responsible for a palace built to outlast its founders, were forced to make difficult choices. The great art collection assembled over decades, piece by piece, became both a source of pride and a burden. Masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Van Narsam Van Dyck, once the heart of America's forgotten palace, began to leave the marble galleries. Some were sold at auction, others were transferred as gifts to museums like the National Gallery of Art and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where their provenance would forever read Linwood Hall. Land, too, was divided and sold. Parcels of the original estate, once intended to keep the family together for generations, were liquidated to satisfy tax obligations. The very scale that had made Linwood Hall a monument to American ambition now worked against its survival. In the end, the estate tax did not just redistribute wealth, it set in motion the gradual dispersal of a dynasty's legacy, leaving behind a mansion too large for any one family or even a single era to sustain. In 1945, the Widener heirs sold Linwood Hall to Faith Theological Seminary for $300,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build nearly half a century earlier. The seminary's leaders saw opportunity in the vast empty halls, not as a monument to vanished wealth, but as a practical solution to the needs of a growing religious institution. The mansion's marble ballroom, once the scene of high society galas, was stripped of its gilded trimmings and refitted as an auditorium, complete with a stage and choir loft. Gallery wings that had displayed Rembrandts and Raphaels became lecture halls and classrooms. Service kitchens were reimagined as a cafeteria and dormitory kitchen, feeding students instead of staff. Most of the changes happened quietly, behind the limestone facade that remained untouched due to historic restrictions. Inside, the grand scale of America's forgotten palace began to lose its original identity. Ornate ceilings were dropped to save on heating, and partition walls carved up the great rooms into practical spaces. The seminary's adaptive reuse was less about preservation than survival, a pragmatic answer to the mounting costs that had driven other Gilded Age mansions to demolition. Yet even as the building was repurposed, the reality of its scale, 110 rooms and 21,000 square feet, remained impossible to escape. Maintenance demands and utility bills mounted, foreshadowing the financial strain that would soon threaten the seminary itself. The transformation from palace to campus was not a rescue, but a pause, a brief chapter in the long story of the mansion too big to save. By the late 1970s, Linwood Hall's immense corridors and marble galleries had become a burden too heavy for its last stewards to bear. Faith Theological Seminary, which had repurposed the grand estate for classrooms and dormitories, faced mounting bills that outpaced any tuition or donation. The numbers told the story: $1.8 million in unpaid property taxes, $2.5 million in deferred maintenance, and another $500,000 owed to utility companies. Each winter, the heating system struggled to keep up with the vast, drafty halls, while summer rains crept through a roof that had not seen proper repair in years. A bankruptcy filing in 1979 laid bare the scale of the crisis. The seminary's Chapter 11 petition listed not only its debts, but also a growing list of structural failures, including a leaking ballroom ceiling, cracked limestone cornices, and rust spreading through the steel frame that once promised centuries of stability. A 1992 audit by preservation architects catalogued the damage in clinical detail. Water infiltration had warped floorboards and peeled away layers of plaster, while corrosion threatened the very skeleton that had once set Linwood Hall apart from its peers. Yet the tragedy unfolding inside America's forgotten palace was not sabotage or vandalism. It was the slow, inexorable consequence of scale. The mansion too big to save, built as a monument to endless fortune, now stood silent, its vastness transformed from a symbol of triumph to a quiet echo of a vanished empire. The future, for the first time, was left unresolved. Linwood Hall stands as America's forgotten palace, a 110-room monument too vast for any heir, too costly for any century. Its silence reminds us that even $100 million cannot preserve a dynasty or secure relevance. As fortunes shift and legacies dissolve, the architecture endures, outlasting those who built it. The real tragedy isn't ruin, but ambition scaled beyond rescue. What would you do with a palace too big to save?